Elizabeth is a tour operator who brings groups to Britain from China and takes tourists from Britain to China. So she operates on both sides of the business. And if I remember rightly, Elizabeth, you were one of the very first English graduate students to go to China to learn Chinese.
Yes, again, much longer ago than I'd care to remember.
Now, unfortunately, the party going on down there is going to continue. So Elizabeth is going to shout into the microphone and we'll do the best we can. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Okay, can everybody hear me? So, I came back from China last Tuesday, and we travelled from Beijing in the north along the Yellow River Valley and down to Shanghai. And so my talk is going to be based on some of the experiences that we had and the encounters we had with aspects of responsible tourism in China. The first thing we did was that we carried out the whole of the journey by train, by the amazing high-speed rail system that now exists in China, where you've got more than 22,000 kilometers of track. We were traveling often, much to my clients' amazement, over 300 kilometers per hour. Now, I've always favored travel by train in China over air travel, but in the past, this journey that we took wouldn't have been possible. We would have had to fly. So I think that the benefit of the electric trains is that they are taking some business away from the airlines, so it's getting very competitive. And as they're electric, there's the potential, if it's not there already, to use diverse sources of energy. The first thing we did in Beijing was we took the Hutong Tour. Again, I like this because it is very much a local initiative. The clients actually get to walk around the old back streets of Beijing in the area around the Forbidden City. And they go by foot and by trishaw, and again they get to engage with local people, which I think is very important. Otherwise you just see China through a bubble. Later on we went down to Xi'an, and although we didn't visit the Qinling Mountains, maybe not many people realize that there are these beautiful mountains to the north of Xi'an, and that the WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, has had a project there since 2001. It's focused on the giant panda, but there are also other very interesting species in the area, such as golden monkeys. And there's been training in sustainable forestry management, a homestay tourism project, which is attractive. Also, you have to remember that domestic tourism market is very big in China as well. It's not just about us coming there, but it's also about what's available for local people. They also, WWF provided an injection of funds and then education on things such as beekeeping, how to, having effective wood stoves and that kind of thing. Then eventually we came down to Shanghai, and I asked one of my friends, I said, well, are Chinese people, Chinese businesses interested in responsible tourism? What do they think of it? And she just said, oh, they only want to make money. But, and these towers are supposed to represent that issue in Shanghai. But, in fact, I came across, thanks to Roy here, he introduced me to the joint US-China Cooperation on Clean Energy organization. And they've been operating for the last 10 years in China, very much a green grassroots operation, led by a very dynamic lady called Peggy Liu, who travels between China and America. So their very interesting initiatives have involved training Chinese mayors at government training schools, so at cadre schools both in Shanghai and in Beijing, in which they discuss how to build livable eco-cities, how to make the best use of local resources, and how to help local businesses develop to benefit from tourism. The other exciting things that they've done is they took took old local houses near to the Great Wall at Mutianyu and transformed old local houses, which are now run by local people. And they recognize that this is kind of movement in China that sort of young urbanites, people who live in the city, they want to be able to escape from the city and return to nature, which after all is very much ingrained in the traditional Chinese character. And so there's not only the Brickyard Hotel at the Great Wall, but there's also so-called naked retreats or eco-retreats at Moganshan, which is very accessible from Shanghai. The other thing they're very involved in, which is also a concern to many young middle-class Chinese, is the idea of farm-to-table food. And there's a Chongming Island, which is close to Shanghai, where that has almost become a very important brand for that now. While we were in China, we were there during the 19th Communist Party of China National Congress. And in a way, this little image represents a lot about it. It says, you know, we're protecting and continuing Chinese traditional crafts with the paper cuts. You've got the high-speed train coming in one corner. You've got the wind farm in the other corner of the design. So, as I mentioned just now, you have the JUCCE with its green grassroots policies, and then you have, I think now, since the 18th CPC Congress, you have top-down policies, which means that somewhere in the middle they should meet. And the party and the government policy supports eco-cultural heritage protection and is sort of enshrined ecological civilization as an important part of the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation, which is something which Mr. Xi talks about a lot, the Chinese dream. And there are aspects of green development and recycling. And then this quote from the China Daily, nature needs time and space to recover. So in a way, I think in those things you have hope and the possibility of both the government and grassroots movements meeting each other and hopefully more initiatives taking place. So that's really all I have to say. And I just put this up because I thought it was nice. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Elizabeth. Roy. No, you need to come here. You're being filmed, don't forget.
All right, okay.
I'm not sure how much you're able to answer this question, Roy, but as part of what you're going to say, do you think you could address the question of why there hasn't been more interest in responsible tourism in China? Because clearly Elizabeth has shown there's lots of opportunity for it.
Okay. Good evening. I'm Roy Graff. I'm Managing Director for EMEA at Dragon Trail Interactive. We're a digital marketing agency that focuses on outbound tourism from China. I'm here because for the last 21 years I've been involved with outbound tourism from China as well as developing tourism within China. And sustainable tourism and ecotourism have been topics very close to my heart for the entire time that I was there, and also here working on tourism with China. I was a council member at Tourism Concern, which is a UK-based charity that campaigns for sustainable tourism, responsible tourism, and tourism that supports local communities. And I was also director for ecotourism at JUICE, which Elizabeth spoke about in a pro bono capacity. So this is really why I'm speaking here today. And I'd like to address this topic from two angles. One is related to what Elizabeth has spoken about and what Harold was just asking about. What does sustainable tourism or responsible tourism means in the Chinese kind of domestic tourism context, and what is China kind of doing about it, and why hasn't it been a bigger topic of discussion there? And the other is, what will be the impact in the next few years of the millions of Chinese who are now discovering international travel and are embracing that in unbelievable speed. There are already really clear examples of the impact in areas around Southeast Asia, and it's pretty likely that these things, if not addressed properly, can have a negative impact on other destinations around the world. So what can be done about that? Taking first the first issue of tourism in China, I think that when you look at any developing country that's really focused on taking a large number of the population out of poverty and educating large numbers of people, I think that things like responsible tourism or ecotourism or generally, kind of recycling, whatever it is, does take a backseat to providing jobs, providing education, providing a living wage, and things like that. So it's a process, it's a phase. We've gone through it before. During the Industrial Revolution in the UK, nobody thought about responsible tourism. And it's kind of inevitable that people need to get to a level of income and convenience in life where they can start thinking about these things for themselves and actually understanding what is the impact of their own actions and us as a collective. Now, that doesn't mean these things are not happening. I think that there are really encouraging areas, encouraging developments in China in the areas of, for example, endangered species. As you may know, traditional Chinese medicine tends to use different animal parts also from endangered animals, and that has been a big problem with poaching in Africa and in Asia. But China has done a lot of steps to ban all ivory, to burn all its stocks of ivory, to basically work with African countries on stopping poaching. And organizations like Traffic, like the Worldwide Fund and Wild Aid are all active in China working with local governments to eradicate that. And while there is a lot of this kind of underground demand, it's something that is taken very seriously, and I do see that there is changes there. There's also grassroots work, grassroots campaigns that are happening. A few years ago, I was reading about some school children in Hong Kong that campaigned Disney World to stop serving shark's fin soup in the restaurants, and actually succeeded in stopping that. And the age of conspicuous consumption in China seems to be kind of winding down. Things like shark's fin soup or eating endangered animals is not something that you see so much in big banquets anymore. So I think that there are changes made there. Now, when it comes to responsible tourism, I think that there is a problem in China that in most of China, in the rural setting, wildlife doesn't really exist anymore. I mean, that kind of, it's been destroyed a long time ago, and it's now trying to come back in certain areas thanks to government protection, making kind of reserves, big nature reserves, and protecting them. But to protect them, they often have to just ban tourism, because if a place becomes popular, it's really hard to stop millions of Chinese visiting if it's really a great place to visit. A good case in point is Jiuzhaigou, which is a beautiful area in a very difficult to access location in Sichuan province. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's been on the endangered list of UNESCO for a long time. It's now sadly was impacted by a very serious earthquake that changed a lot of the landscape there and created major damage. But they had to limit the numbers of people visiting at about 20,000 per day, and that's already way too much for this place. And the problem is when you have, especially in the high season, these number of people there, when you go there, you don't actually get to see very much. You see thousands of people everywhere. So in the case of Jiuzhaigou, they have other areas, other valleys that are closed off from tourism and are not, they don't let people in there because they need to protect the local environment. And myself and a team of eco-tourism specialists from New Zealand visited them a couple of years ago to basically work with them on what they can do with these other valleys that haven't been open, whether they can be kind of developed in a different way for ecotourism. So opening up to small groups, to small individuals on a very kind of selective basis who can do camping there, but will know how to protect the natural environment. And so these initiatives are taking place. And I think it's important for the global community, especially in responsible tourism, to be more involved, to kind of bridge the communication gap and take more of an interest in that and share resources, share knowledge. Oftentimes, there are cultural differences that make that communication difficult, but in China, a lot of, again, small-scale initiatives in rural kind of tourism, agro-tourism are just happening by people because, as Elizabeth mentioned, people in the cities are now looking for this kind of respite and looking for something more natural and more clean living, and are finding it in guest houses and agro farms not so far from Beijing or other big cities. And I think that just the middle classes, as they're emerging, are figuring out that that is a better way to travel. So let's just flip it around and talk about outbound travel. I don't want to go through, I can't go through the whole history of how it developed, but at the moment what is happening is that you've got about 122 million outbound trips last year. The vast majority are to Southeast Asia. And Europe gets about 10, 12 million last year. It's growing in double digits. So it's, you know, it has the potential of quickly overwhelming destinations. And a case in point would be Bali. Bali got about 2 million Chinese last year out of 15 million tourists. But the Balinese Tourism Bureau wants to reach about 10 million Chinese in 2 years' time. Now, in terms of the capacity of the Chinese to travel and get to a place which is reasonably close and very exotic to them and has, you know, very rich culture, it's possible, but is it advisable? I mean, already Bali is hurting from over-tourism. The use of water there is basically damaging the ability of locals to get access to water for farming. The runoff from pollution, from golf resorts and things like that is damaging the corals. All the building work there, the construction is damaging the corals. So, you know, there's a big kind of movement in Bali resisting more tourism. But of course, you know, I'm here because I do believe tourism is a force for good in terms of economic development, of having ability to grow, to raise money from industries that are less damaging than other industries, and therefore it's important that governments take a lead here and actually work with local communities to listen to what they want. And in many cases, in destinations that do it successfully, it's basically involving lower scale, kind of smaller scale tourism, and gradually kind of maybe increasing the price so less people can come, but those people are getting a better experience and are maybe also getting some education on how, you know, what they do there, what is their impact, both the negative and positive impact. And because Chinese generally, when they travel, they need Chinese services, and I think that it's important to also provide this educational information about their impact in Chinese and work with Chinese travel companies. Last point, one of the largest travel companies and travel kind of portals in China, Chongyor or QYER.com, have partnered with Traffic, the NGO, to educate and to produce a leaflet, a brochure, a booklet that they give to all the outbound travelers, all their clients, about responsible tourism. And that's starting to make an impact. And they're the only OTA in China that is doing that and basically helps people understand what is the best way to travel. And they indicate on their website various attractions that may not be so fair or so responsible. For example, if it's a dolphinarium, a SeaWorld type thing, they indicate on their booklet that there are issues around you know, wildlife and whales in captivity. So those kind of things are starting to make an impact. You know, it's early days, but it's very encouraging. Thank you very much.
Can we hear what UNWTO have to suggest about? You were looking askance at some of the things that were said. I'm sure you're going to correct the record, Suji.
Thank you, Harold. Unlike in the morning that Harold invited me to speak among the Indians, being non-Indian, and now I'm the only Chinese talking about Chinese initiative, although being the representative of the World Tourism Organization, the UNWTO. But the downside of it is that it seems that everyone is a bit hungry and start going out of the the WTM fairground. But I must say that for WTM to pick up a country like China and link it with the concept of responsible tourism is something very significant. Significant in the sense of what you already heard, the sheer size of the travel population of China, especially the sheer size of the domestic travel within China. So anything that we do or we don't do will certainly have significant impact on China itself, but more importantly, on the rest of the world. But if I may use my next few minutes to share a few points with you. Number one, I would say that we are quite lucky as we speak that in China, when it comes to responsible principle or sustainability philosophy, we do have that political awareness at the highest level. I'm not talking about the tourism sector alone. If you allow me to quote what the President of China recently mentioned repeatedly, that he actually associated the natural resources of green mountains and blue waters to that of gold and that of silver that I heard earlier, that although you have the high rises of Shanghai, and that is very much linked with silver and gold, but the highest level of the authority is starting to look at and compare and contrast with that of the natural resources of mountains and rivers. And to apply that to the sector of tourism is certainly, I think we are quite lucky to have that political awareness of the government. Now, if I may share with you the second point about the responsible tourism in China. Perhaps I wanted to look at, first of all, it's about inside China, the domestic tourism. As you heard, that we're talking about a huge volume of traffic flow. And to me, if we wanted to link that traffic volume vis-a-vis the responsible concept, what we are talking about is more of a degree of governance. We must think about the traffic size. It's not like what we heard earlier in the morning about community development and how you can sustain the development in a responsible manner. In the Chinese context, to control the traffic, to make sure that the parking lot is sufficient, it's type of responsible tourism. It's about how to manage it. It's about how to control it. It's about good governance that you need to achieve. Secondly, you also heard that one of the initial concepts of tourism development that links with the Chinese tourism is more linked with the poverty reduction. Now, on the surface of it, you might want to link it more with the economic side of it. But to me, it is also social. 17% of the population that has been lifted out of poverty was due to tourism. So from that social aspect, I would say this is a type of responsible format of development. But if I also look at cities, destinations, and regions, especially those remote places, that they have been able to use tourism as a very powerful tool in order to beautify the places of residence and to benefit the local residents. I consider that not only as an economic development, but also as part of the social responsibility of any development process. A great example of the responsible tourism initiative in China is that of the UNWTO's initiative, we up to now have opened up 9 sustainable tourism observatories in the most popular tourist destinations of China, whereby we try to measure socially, we try to measure economically, and we try to measure environmentally how tourism development process has impacted both positively and negatively to the local societies from these 3 perspectives. So from that angle, I think not only that you have the political awareness, but also on the ground, some observatories are being tested in order to push that development process. My last point, ladies and gentlemen, that I wanted to share with you is very much to the link with what Roy was mentioning, that 1 out of 10 world travelers nowadays comes from China. So every 10th traveler is from the Chinese mainland. And in order to make sure that this huge traffic volume is impacting positively on the rest of the destinations of the world, it's not only a question of what you heard about the issue of education to the Chinese travelers, but I think it is high time for us also to look at what we did in the earlier days to the European tourists or to the American tourists, how these tourists can contribute socially and politically to the destinations in a very responsible manner. And lastly, ladies and gentlemen, if I may say so, the issue of responsible tourism or the issue of the vast traffic of the Chinese population is not about how we can control it or we will lose control of it. The way forward to me is not about controlling the growth. The way forward for me is more about how we can disperse the traffic, because many millions of people in the destination sites, their lives depend on this. And you cannot just simply say we should stop the traffic. Thank you.
One of the things that strikes me about the Chinese market is that I was in deep mid-Wales fishing in May last year, and as we left, there was a self-drive hire car just stuck in the middle of the road with 4 Chinese tourists having got out of it to take a photograph of a sheep. And what's interesting for me about that is, first of all, the excitement about other people's everyday life, which that's a classic example of. If you told a Welshman that Chinese people got out of a car to take photographs of sheep, they'd be very surprised, because for Welsh people, the sheep are a normal thing. But what was interesting was these were FIT travellers already from China in deepest mid-Wales. And we've had some in Faversham, which is a small market town of 20,000 people. It's not obviously on a tourist route. And the point is, I think, that the Chinese have moved really quickly through stages of tourism development that took years in Europe. To your point, those early European travellers were in coaches and plane loads for a long time. The Chinese seem to move very quickly through that phase, and they're travelling as FITs. Is there a question from the floor?
Thank you, Harold. Vicky, Earth Changers. This is maybe a little unfair question. It's a responsible tourism question as opposed to necessarily a Chinese question. But Roy, you mentioned the increase of travellers from 2 million to 10 million to Bali. Can you just remind me, was that coming from the Balinese tourist board who wanted those numbers, or was that coming from the Chinese outbound side of things?
Hello? Okay. So those are numbers, those are target numbers from the Balinese Tourism Board. Yes.
So my question is exactly that. We talk about, you know, everyone's targeting on actual numbers, and responsible tourism, we want to look at profitability, but just not economic profitability, but social profitability, environmental profitability. From your perspectives, from UNWTO, what can be done to change those targets so that they are targeted more responsibly?
Well, probably the short answer to this is as I mentioned as my last point, it's about dispersal to less popular sites of the same destination. If you move, say, from Yogyakarta, the Borobudur site in Indonesia, just 10 kilometers away from there, there's no tourists. If you move from the Angkor Wat site of Cambodia and to 10 kilometers away, there are no tourists over there. So to me, it's not about, of course we need to control the traffic of that very site, but there are a number of places that are still yet to be visited. We need to have a good planning process, we need to have a good development process, and we need to have a good management process. But the answer shouldn't be that black and white. To me, we need to look at the broader picture of not only social aspect, but also economic aspect.
I just want to add that I think there's also one thing which is an accounting issue. I've faced this in Sri Lanka recently. Sri Lanka has seen 100% increase in tourism from China for the last 4 years. And it's slowing down now, but it's been just booming. And they want to get a lot of Chinese tourists. They spend a lot of money, they buy stuff, they're good customers. But if it goes in this way, considering Sri Lanka still has a lot of underdevelopment in its own infrastructure, it's going to be a problem. And I think people on the ground know that. And to your question, perhaps the way we measure tourism success shouldn't be about the number of people, but it should be about revenue. Yeah, because you can have half the number of people still living a lot more revenue if you give them the right service and the right services and experiences. So maybe we should just not stop counting people, count the actual money that generated into the local economy.
Is there another question? Elizabeth, would you like a final word?
You put me on the spot.
Yeah.
Well, I actually think that finally we've managed to bring this together. And I think you're totally right. There should have been many more Chinese people on the panel and not Waiguoren.
Elizabeth, in your defence, you've tried very hard.
Yes, I've talked to China National Tourist Office over many years, tried to encourage them to come, talk to different colleagues, and I would like to see another session next year but I do feel it's a beginning. No, don't think so. But
I'm sure that's not true.
I think it's a great starting point.
Roy, do you want to have a final word?
Please. Thank you for visiting World Travel Market 2017. The exhibition is now closed.
You're still entitled to speak.
Okay, thank you. I think that focusing more on independent Chinese as opposed to groups is a way of dispersing their visits to lots of more places and spending more money in the local economy. So that's one thing, is working to encourage a move from groups to FIT. And creating a lot more content about responsible tourism, working with these big travel companies like Ctrip, like Chongyo, that actually do care about this and want to see change, but they need support.
Suji, did I understand what you were saying earlier as your expression of support to help me organise something next year?
Of course, you have my full commitment both institutionally
You're on film.
and personally as a Chinese. But probably as my final word, which might be a slightly different from the discussion topic, but rather on the Chinese market as a whole, since we are now in WTM. Think less familiar digital platforms of Europe or North America. More focus on those digital platforms that are being used by the Chinese, like the WeChat, like all of these digital platforms, which are basically unknown to this part of the world, but this is where they are being used more popularly.
Absolutely. I think I completely agree about that. And for too many years, we've talked about a global market for tourism, And with the Chinese coming on as strong as they have, but also India, it's very clear that they are not using the same mechanisms to enter the marketplace. Can I thank our final panel for today? It's been fascinating. I personally am delighted that we finally managed to do it, and we will do it again next year with your help. Thank you very much indeed.